You are live on CountrySlide. This is a special one. We have just been to the farmers' protest in London, and we were doing some, I suppose you'd call it investigative journalism. Easy for you to say. Richard and I, Richard, who is a hedge layer that works in the countryside, building hedges which are habitat for small and tiny fluffy animals, as well as birds and whatever else. He's making silly faces at me as I say it. He relishes the idea of being a celebrity hedge layer, which is what he got branded. Ugh. So the celebrity hedge layer Richard Negus and I went there, and I photographed the whole event, and Richard spoke to the people, and we're going to discuss what's happening, where we're at, the positive steps we can use to rally the government in order to change this, should you so wish. And it's going to be a long, meandering conversation about the budget, farmers, politics, and putting the world to rights. So I hope you enjoy this podcast. So Richard, who is a professional hedge layer that works in the industry and very much relies on farmers for his income, for his day job, as well as being a very talented writer and observing about all the stuff that he does inside the countryside. He also is a hedge layer, and his money largely comes from the subsidies. Would you say that was correct?
It's no longer a subsidy, to be perfectly honest. I'm funded through stewardship grants under the Environmental Land Management Scheme. So 97% of my income comes directly from farmers, that they receive grants to improve the biodiversity. I mean, the whole notion behind this is supposed to be what Michael Gove, when he created this post-Brexit, was a thing called ELMS, which was supposedly public money for public good. The public good that I help farmers provide is by improving the habitats around the edges of the field in which they're growing crops. And that is largely by improving the field margins floristically, how they're cut and managed, etc. And most importantly, the hedgerows themselves, by laying or coppicing them, thickening them up, which makes them a better habitat for nesting birds, for a huge array of invertebrates, small mammals, etc., etc. I mean, yesterday I was laying day before yesterday, because I was in London yesterday, day before yesterday, I was laying a hedge, one of my farms, and you suddenly discover how fantastic there's a dormouse nest from last season. So hopefully, after I've finished my work, that hedge is now more suitable for not just to find one dormouse nest. We will start finding more because the habitat is improved. So in a nutshell, I'm not laying hedges for stock proofing like the old days. I'm laying hedges to improve them for wildlife on farmland. So I rely utterly on the goodwill and support of farmers who want to employ me in the business. They rely wholly to pay for my work on what they find down the back of the tractor seat, and also the grant funding they received is no longer a subsidy. Farmers do not get subsidies anymore for anything. That went out the window when we left the European Union.
But they get some grant funding, which is largely what you rely on as income. Of course, it can be potentially supplemented from income from the farm, but largely you are massively affected by the budget and the decisions that have been made as a result.
Utterly. The budget was, I suppose, almost as potentially career-ending for me as it was for the farmers. As I think we'll talk in a bit further detail further on. The only difference is I suppose I could go and get another job tomorrow. I already write. I get paid to write. And I suppose probably if the worst came to the worst, I'd have to go and start gardening or working on small hobby farms and laying their hedges. And all the people who want to sort of have a pastiche of the rural idyll of laid hedges. A lot of hedge layers make a good living by laying hedges for the people who have moved to the countryside, bought 10, 20 acres of paddock and want to sort of make it look wilder and better for wildlife. And they lay hedges for them for the same purpose that I do, but on a sort of, if you like, a non-professional scale. I just happen to do it for farmers on a professional scale. So what happens if the budget for me, yes, it could be career ending, but I've got a fairly easy path out if worst came to the worst financially. For the farmers, is a little bit different in the fact that they could quite literally lose the family farm. And that, as I discovered more, I mean, I've worked in and around farming since I left the army, and I actually learned something yesterday that I really hadn't quite grasped, is just the sheer level of passion and emotion that land means to those who own it, farm it, and take their meager living from it. It was an eye-opener for me as much as it was for you.
On that subject, what I've just been joined by the dog.
Excellent. Hello, Lark. Bless her. Invading the personal space. I think we ought to go and dedicate one of these podcasts just to our dogs. Only Mabel, of course. Blythe's a complete idiot. She'd just fill it with interesting stories of biscuits.
Yeah, I think look forward to the dog special in the not too distant future.
Yeah.
Okay, so in a nutshell, can you tell me what was the raucous all about yesterday and what actually happened? The farmers protested. Give me a sense of what it looked like to be there.
Okay, well, why were they protesting, first of all? The budget that the Labour government released had quite a swathe of tax hikes and quite a number of things as well that were taken away benefits. Now, we all know today it was announced that apparently 100,000 elderly people are now officially in poverty, courtesy of the removal of winter fuel payment. So that affected a certain section of society. Another section of society, the farming community, were affected because back in 1985, Margaret Thatcher brought in a new law, which was largely well received, actually, whereby they removed inheritance tax from agricultural land. So, therefore, essentially, when one farmer dies, the farm could be passed on to a son, grandson, and no inheritance tax was payable, largely because that reflected back in 1985 that at that point the price of food was of the receipt of the money coming in from growing food was declining and the costs of production were going up. So along with the subsidies that farmers received to grow food, there was an element of saying, well, the only asset you have is your land, so therefore we won't tax your land, we'll only tax what is grown on that land. So it made farming a sustainable enterprise. So there was a relatively smooth transition with no troubling the tax man of passing a farm down a family line so there could be a level of continuity. It's never been a path to riches, farming, certainly not in recent times, and that was why they brought in what was called APR, Agricultural Property Relief. There's a similar thing called Business Property Relief, which covers family businesses that have assets too, and farmers tend to fall underneath that as well. So a lot of their, say for example, the couple of million they've got in farm machinery, a lot of the other infrastructure stuff that they have, that falls underneath business property relief. The actual land itself, the house they live in, the woods that they have, if they're worked, they fall under agricultural property. So there's no tax to pay. Now, Rachel Reeves decided, she says, following advice from expert taxation analysts, that she wanted to remove agricultural property relief and business property relief. She also, there were a number of other things within the budget, which directly impacted farmers, one of which was a cessation of the basic payment scheme, which is an old hangover from the EU. She capped that at £7,200. So that removed liquidity from the economy. She also went
Yes,
to tax my pickup truck.
as we discussed in last
As we did,
week's
we did.
issue. Yeah.
So the main two cruxes for what the farmers were protesting about was the introduction of APR and BPR, or removal of those benefits to landowners. Now, she justifies this decision by saying that it will not affect many farmers. There's a floating figure. For one moment, they said 75 farms will be affected. Then it was raised to 500. But essentially, what she's trying to stop is land bankers. So people who go and buy farmland in a bid to secure their investment against inheritance tax. And they won't work that land as a farm. And it's essentially, if you like, old school Labour, is you smash the rich to help the poor. And the line that the Chancellor sort of used then and is sticking to now is that, well, if we all want to have a national health service, then people have got to pay, and one of those people have got to pay are farmers. The perception being that because these people are land rich, and they are land rich, land prices around here between 10 to 11,000 pounds an acre is quite normal. Most average farms here, 400, 500 acres, something like that. So they are certainly land rich, but they're cash poor. So therefore, the protest was all about what was seen as an unfair tax. Rachel Reeves' argument is the fact that everyone's got to take a hit, because she says there's a £22 billion black hole created by the Conservative previous administration, and that was where the horns were locked. And why? Some people say 10,000, others say 20,000. So let's say, with averages, 15,000 farmers and people like me who rely upon a healthy agricultural sector went to Whitehall to try and express our concern in a mass protest. But also there was a secondary mass lobbying event by members of the National Farmers Union to rural members of Parliament from all parties held within Portcullis House, within the Palace of Westminster itself. And so that the case could be made by members of the National Farmers Union as to why they believe that so many of the budgetary decisions were not only vindictive to farming, as they claimed it to be, but also that they were unfair and would create an absolute hole in the whole of our food sustainability and rural economy being a wider thing.
I'm here today because I feel strongly about the future of farming. The decisions that have been proposed are made in big buildings in the city by people that don't appear to understand the consequences. They suggest that we need to reduce pollution, yet they're happy to import even more food in. Small farms will be destroyed forever, and we beg them to see the error of their ways before it's too late.
If you could have a chat today with Rachel Reeves, who's the Chancellor, if you want to be a farmer, what do you think are the things that you need that could make a difference to making whether you could make a career out of it or not?
Support, basically.
Okay, and you don't think she's giving you that support?
No, I don't think she is.
Being there and speaking to people, I'm struggling to see the reason that this has been put in place in the budget. And I'm not entirely sure that that's not just most of the inputs I have are from on the ground people that are adversely affected by such a decision. But there must be some reason that this has been made. One of the things I kept hearing is how about the cash flow of the farming businesses, and figures of like actual farms saying their return is like 1% or 2% on the capital they have invested. So if you've got a 10 million quid farm and you're turning over 1 or 2% at best, it's hardly like they're in it for the money. It's not like they're making incredible profits. So to pay a hefty tax on such a thing is going to cripple them. And they've got 10 years to pay it, is what I got told. So 10 years to pay this amount. Explain to me what abuse of the system looks like, just so I can understand that.
Okay, abuse of the system is possible. I mean, bizarrely, the candidates who the government and its supporters most readily put up as examples of people who have done this to avoid inheritance tax are Jeremy Clarkson and James Dyson. Now, they have chosen the two worst candidates for that because incredibly wealthy people they are, and I'm sure that their tax advisors did suggest to them that a good way of investing surplus cash rather than putting it offshore was to invest it in land because there were inheritance tax advantages. Clarkson himself admitted that the first reason why he bought his diddly squat farm that's now become so famous, is almost like the totem of British farms, was because he wanted to shoot. He wanted a pheasant shoot. He unashamedly enjoys shooting and he wanted to shoot. So therefore, if you own a land just for shooting, it's not registered as farmland, you wouldn't benefit from this inheritance tax benefit. So therefore, he bought a farm and he decided to work the farm, just the same as James Dyson did. I mean, there's an interesting thing, there are people saying, oh, James Dyson just lives offshore in Singapore or something like that. Well, a friend of mine actually down the road who I've done some hedge laying for near Banham in Norfolk, he breeds a particularly good strain of beef cattle. And he said that Dyson appeared at his farm because they wanted to buy some of his cattle for, they said, wanted to buy some of the cattle. And they just assumed that it would be his cowman would appear. But no, hey presto, appearing at his farm, there was James Dyson. And James Dyson was absolutely, he was the man. He wanted to choose those particular cattle. Clarkson, as we've seen, I mean, they've made one onto the Series 4 or something like that. He's bought into this fact that farming is a job, is a way of life. It's something that he takes part in. Is he doing it all the time? No. He has experts who, like Caleb and others, who do some of the work for him, but he is ostensibly a farmer. So therefore, they're choosing bad examples to point out as pariahs for it. There are, doubtless, some of the big corporates who do buy land, particularly those who are looking to offset for carbon and for biodiversity net gain and stuff like that. They will buy farmland and not really farm it in any shape or form. It's more because they want to assuage their carbon debt that they have from their business, big oil companies, airlines, etc. They are buying land up for that, but they don't actually. The inheritance tax thing is not actually that important to them because they are not family businesses. So therefore, it's just part and parcel of their land holding. And they're really buying land as a means of offsetting the dirt that their own business creates, whether it is biodiversity loss because they're house builders, or whether it is an airline that pumps out millions of tons of carbon into the atmosphere each time. They buy land and then on paper they are suddenly somehow or other carbon neutral and clean as the air itself. So it's quite nonsensical. The really daft thing I don't get about it, and it's something where I think the government have already realised they've screwed up. Daniel Zeichner, the farming minister, who poor chap seems to be the fall guy for the mistakes, and mistakes I believe they are, that Reeves has made, is already advising people on how to not pay this tax. So, he said, well, if you actually split your farm into, pass some on to your wife, and then you can pass some on to your sons. And if you haven't got enough sons, pass it on to a cousin, basically pass it on to everyone other than the family Labrador. he's telling you how to avoid it, and then say you'll be fine. We are thinking, well, if this money is so important to the government, why on earth are they telling you how to avoid this tax? You would think if there genuinely was this urgent need for cash to be drawn from the land, you would think that they'd say, sorry, mate, tough shit. There is no get out of jail card here. You're going to have to pay because we've decided that farmers are feather bedded individuals who, yes, you may be cash poor, but your land is worth so much money. We want to get rid of this. And I think when your own government ministers are telling you how to avoid paying tax, it probably indicates it's either a flawed policy or they're realizing we've actually cocked this up, haven't we? And it's easier to go and tell you how to avoid it than actually do a U-turn and say, well, let's cancel that and go and try and tax someone else.
Yeah, it wouldn't be the first time that they've, the government has done a U-turn on budget policy. But I think the further down the line they get with it, the worse it becomes. I'm just not sure how there's a remedy for it. Like you say, tax efficient methods are going to be the one that most people use. I suppose they can turn their farm into limited companies and work out a way in which to do that. But obviously, passing it on early as well, gifting it, you need to survive for 7 years.
Yeah, 7 years.
I saw the placard which I photographed. I think it's one of my favourites actually. Yeah. I did post it on Twitter, which is "I can't afford to die," because you imagine what their tax bill is.
Yeah, I mean, we went on this protest, and I don't know about you, Callum, but I'm not a regular attendee at protests. I'm actually somebody who I usually think they're counterproductive. I think it was interesting. This particular protest, there was a quite remarkable level of goodwill. When you get off the train, we didn't exactly, well, I didn't go dressed as I was going for a day's hedge laying, but I wore a rather mud-bedaubed coat, a flat cap because it was raining, a pair of old combat trousers and a pair of boots. And most of the people who were there, they dressed like they were farmers. I think they were trying to show, look, we are farmers. So there were lots of overalls and wellies and little kids in John Deere mini overalls and sat on miniature tractors.
It's fantastic, yeah.
It was a marvellous image. And it was because we stood out, it was quite surprising the level of support. And I can imagine that some people on the left are going to utterly decry and say, liar, if you didn't get a photograph of it, it didn't happen. But I was stopped when I was on my way to a meeting after you and I separated after the protest. I went off to a meeting with some MPs, and I was stopped at a set of some temporary traffic lights near Church House, which is one of the bits of the Palace of Westminster, by a paramedic and the other paramedic driving an ambulance. And they stopped, and the traffic lights kept changing from right through all the different colours, and cars had to sort of go about them. And they wound the window down and they said, "Hello, mate, you're on this farmers' protest, aren't you?" Because they could tell by my attire. And I said, yes. And they said, well, what can we do to tell Keir Starmer, and I quote this, well, what can I do to tell Keir Starmer that we want him to change his mind? And I was stunned for a moment. I thought, well, I never, it's just something that seems so alien that two London ambulance men, as I would still call them in my 1970s way, wanted to stop me to ask them what they could do to help us. And when I had time to think, I said, well, the reason why we're here protesting, one of the reasons that we're told by the Chancellor, is that there will be no NHS unless farming gets hit. And I explained to them, I said, look, what I do is I'm a hedge layer. I make the green lung of the land work that bit more efficiently. And we know that good health comes with a healthy environment, and that the guys who are doing the stuff in the middle of that field, growing your food, good food, keeps you healthy. I said, it's a far better use of resources for the NHS if we have a healthy, well-fed populace with clean air, clean water, and wildlife to look at when we go out for a nutritious walk, that we do that. So I said, write to your local MP, tell them that today you were working on the streets of London on call, and that you met this bloke who's a hedge layer from a place called Suffolk, and he said, that I support the NHS, but I don't think the way to help you paramedics do your job is by making the people who pay me poorer and go out of business. And they wanted to chat for longer, but I sort of said, I've got a very important meeting with an MP to go to. And the goodwill from those two men summed up the amount of smiles that I saw largely from people, because the protest itself, that bit we were in, was not raucous. It wasn't angry. There wasn't there wasn't the usual whistle blowing and drums banging and shouts of Starmer out or kill this or ban that or anything. It was different.
As a photographer, I actually really struggled because everybody I took pictures of was smiling. They have a very important job to do, but they were all happy. They were not all angry. They were just people showing up to get their point across. That's the thing, and I think those people sum it up really well. What can we do? Showing up at a protest, of course, it's going to help. Getting the press coverage is going to help. These pictures, hopefully, it will help. But I also have a feeling that it's not enough. So writing to your MP is a practical step that we can take, but still incredibly difficult.
I think it is. And that's why this protest, and I think it's important we talk about it, because the overt thing, what did we see in the actual protest bit of it, was we saw, what were the takeaways? If you look in the media, there was some bloke who he's as much a farmer as I am a vegan, who had a megaphone in his mouth after the end of it, who was shouting, what was he shouting? No farmers, no food.
Yeah, no farmers, in which everyone said no food.
No food.
Back
yeah,
to
and it was an image that was used by even the Times in their little bit of video footage they put on one of their articles about it. He topped and tailed it. He wasn't a farmer. The people who were carrying those placards there were one or two sort of people who join in any single protest, blaming it all on the World Economic Forum. That apparently
a lot of hijackers, a lot of
yeah, there were, and I saw this dude with his megaphone shouting away, which made some stuff. It was clearly actually, if he's in farming at all, he'd certainly be on the peripheries. But I looked at it. I always judge a man by his hands, and those were as soft as a baby's arse. The other thing that I suppose was the takeaway was the de facto spokesperson of British farming, who is now Jeremy Clarkson. So the headlines were made of that car crash interview that Ms. Derbyshire tried to do with him, were basically sort of outed him as a land banker. And usually, I think he's had a heart attack recently, Clarkson, and usually he would be brilliant, but he showed his frustration, I think, at the whole situation by not answering her as well as he usually would do. And he sort of just looked at her with these ridiculous questions that she was asking him, and by de facto the whole of the march there. And he sort of didn't reply perhaps as well as he could. But then when he actually went on the stage, was this ersatz back of a lorry, load of old straw bales up there. He followed in the wake of Kemi Badenoch, who got a very good reception. He followed in the wake of Mr. Davey, the Lib Dem leader. Ed Davies' reception was welcome too, perhaps less effusive than that of Kemi Badenoch's. Richard Tice, people literally seemed to sort of yawn. It was quite interesting. So it wasn't a sort of like reform love-in. But when Clarkson got on stage, it was the only time the thing really became animated, because he's a very good public speaker. But he also now has been farming for 5-6 years, and he talks the language of the farmer, and he shares their woes, and he knows from first-hand experience the whinges, complaints, and the deep-seated unhappiness that they have in this budget, and that animated them. But there was never once in that whole process this angry, visceral rage that one usually associates with a protest. Very interesting for people who are inevitably going to lose their businesses.
I think it was largely emotional. It was a lot of children there. A lot of people holding placards which had signs of their children with their sheepdog on a tractor, and it was very much a small farmer that wants to pass their farm down to the next generation, that has a 1.9% profit from their farm, that is now being asked to pay an inheritance tax. The numbers don't work out. The inheritance tax to pass it on to their children would far outstrip the profit that is made from the farm. So liquidating all of the assets is essentially the only way they can do it, and they don't want to sell their farm because it's been in their family for generations. And that is exactly what I saw there. And people were just sad. Sad.
Sad. Yeah.
It
Holy
was
that Callum.
They were all there together, just being like, what the hell are we to do? It's like despair and sadness. They had their kids there and they knew exactly what was going on, and saying, listen, the government is going to take some of this from you. You might not have it.
Well, you think of those. We didn't interview many people because, I mean, I'm actually not a very good journalist. I like writing and I like putting down my thoughts on paper, but I don't think I'm a very good journalist. And I forgot to interview people. But there were those two little boys, you know, three lads and their mother walking along. You know, there were 8, 9, and 7. Ezekiel and Nehemiah. And those two kids had written their own speeches. I don't know who they thought they were going to speak to. As luck would have it, we were the only people who got it because it was raining so hard. Their poor little bits of paper that they pulled out from inside their boiler suits disintegrated in the rain. So we have got exclusives, whether they wanted it to be exclusive or not. But the things that those kids were saying, I'm sure that they had listened to their parents. They farmed on the Surrey-Sussex border. They were sheep farmers. And, you know, they said that their dad was at home looking after the livestock, so mum had brought them to this protest. And the things they wrote, yes, I'm sure there were words that they'd heard from their parents, but that was written in their own handwriting and their own thought. And both of them, there was a pleading in them. Please listen to us. You are destroying something. And both of them wrote about the fact that if you do this, we're going to end up with a world more polluted because we're going to have to import our food. And if these kids aged 9 and 8, if they get it, that they see that this is utterly unjustified, they're a small farming family, you think, well, how can it be that a supposed expert in economics that Rachel Reeves tells us she is, why can't she get it? And so I think you highlighted it there perfectly in the fact that there was a feeling of sadness.
I think that farming should keep on going because the government does not see the consequences of putting taxes on small farms. The nation will not thrive if all small family farms cease to exist. Most farmers are already pushed to their limits. That they are trying to stop pollution, not cause more by shipping food in, and that's why I'm here.
Well, that's very, very good. And so your aim in life once you leave school is going to go into farming?
Yeah.
And you farm at home, do you?
Yes.
And what do you farm?
Beef and just pigs,
Yeah.
sheep, yeah, horses.
Okay. And so, do you think that your future as a young farmer is in a worse place now than it was before July the 4th when the election came? You realise that already. And how old are you?
9 years old.
And so at 9 years old, you're already seeing your future is getting damaged by this budget and then this government.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a sad old state of affairs, really. Thank you.
And that was then reflected when you and I parted our ways and I went off to go and join the NFU part of this protest, which was a direct lobbying event.
So that was directly speaking to MPs, was it not?
Yeah, very much so. So the NFU, I think, are in
to be honest, it's all well and good having the people out there, and putting this out to media en masse highlights the issue, and the more topical it becomes, the more proactive people are, the better. But really, you need to be speaking to the decision makers. So this multi-pronged attack to help solve this issue is definitely the way forward. So who are you speaking to and why, Richard?
Well, okay, how the NFU had worked it was that they had 1,800 representatives, National Farmers Union members. I hasten to add, not all farmers are a member of the NFU. I mean, the NFU, I suppose, is sometimes seen by some as a bit fuddy-duddy, a bit, that they are a lobbying union rather than a typical trades union. But I suppose they are a trades union in their own way, but they're a trades union for people who are all self-employed. But the idea was they'd taken 1,800 farmers from all across the country, and they'd invited the constituency MPs of those farmers. And what the idea was that so many of the MPs were prepared to sit down in an office and hear either individually or from groups of these farmers who from their own constituency who could then plight their case to them regardless of the party that they represented. And their job was to listen and to pass on that feedback to the farming minister, to the DEFRA Secretary of State, ultimately then to the Chancellor and the Prime Minister. I went largely to one which I felt most closely associated, which was Waveney Valley, which was to meet Adrian Ramsey, who is the Green Party, co-leader of the Green Party, and my local constituency MP. And there were about 30 of us. I think the feeling was, before we went in, was that most of the farmers in the constituency would certainly be large C and or small c Conservatives. I think that the idea of having a Green Party MP was certainly a surprise to them when he was voted in, and there was a feeling that possibly he wasn't necessarily an ally. That was the feelings before he went in. To give Ramsey his due, he sat there and he said, "I'm here to listen to you, and I'm going to help as much as I can." What he heard reflected exactly what you and I noticed in that protest. There was not anger. There was not anything that could be construed as force or vindictiveness or finger pointing. It was sadness, I think, is the closest word I could say. And it became ridiculously sad and very emotional in this room. Ridiculous in the fact of not it's stupid. It was something I didn't think I'd experience in that environment.
If you want to get these stories across, if you want to do anything, any kind of messaging, stories from real people, the things that are actually happening are the things that resonate and ultimately can turn the tide on political issues. And I think it's so important to tell those individual stories. And I think that's what a lot of people had there, with stories specifically to them. And it wasn't, I don't want to pay inheritance tax. Those stories were absolutely so powerful. Can you share any of those specifics?
Yeah, I think two which need to be heard. The first one was, he won't mind me saying his name in public, called Paul Baker. He's in our farm cluster. He's a mixed arable and dairy farmer, and his mother's 91. And
for idiots like me, a farm cluster, explain what that is.
Okay, farm cluster is a group, in our case it's called the High Suffolk Farm Cluster. It's a group of 16 farmers who join together in a loose collaboration, 6,000 or so hectares, and they join together ostensibly, so it's almost like a mini cooperative, is that they can do shared buying, seed and fertilizer and stuff like that. But more to the point, it's largely based around how we are going to facilitate the aims of ELMS. So rather than working each farm as an individual conservation site, we link, if you like, the whole 6,000 hectares together as a single landmass and try and join it together with hedgerows. Each farm will have nodal features. If there is a particular species like the grey partridge, this is doing well on one farm, well, let's try and replicate some of the landscape features that is causing them to want to be there. We replicate that across there, and clusters are usually based around a single soil type, geographically speaking. So we're in the high Suffolk clay belt, and also a river catchment area, so that our shared good that we do to the land is reflected for society as a wider thing, so that the water that flows through there is clean, the air is cleaner, there's more wildlife. There is a mutual benefit, there is some financial benefit, but largely it's all about the environmental good.
So they're all the small independent farms.
Yeah, they're all small independent farms. Every single one is owned by a family. They all
come
work
together.
They all work their own land, and they come together to better their businesses and better the wider environment, and hopefully produce more sustainable, cost-effective food. Because if you like, there's sort of there is shared knowledge exchange, shared machinery. It's a very sensible way of farming, and increasing. There's about 100 farm clusters now across the landscape.
So absolutely not your big corporate land grabbing.
It's neither owned, but there's no corporates, there's no lords, there's no earls. There's plenty of other farm clusters who have lords and earls in, and trust you me, some of these grand old landed estates is damn handy if you've got Holcombe in your farm cluster, because the Earl of Leicester may be the Earl of Leicester, but he's also Tom Lester, who's got a damn good bunch of people who work for him. And why you would want a good neighbour like that on your boundary, because he's got resources which you perhaps don't have, and he's also possibly got the ear of other people to go and get external funding in to go and secure a cluster-wide conservation project. But the thing, I get back to Paul, has got two issues which he highlights. Firstly, his mother is 91. She wanted to remain a partner in the family firm. If his mother dies before April the 26th, April 2026, then he said financially it'll be okay. So I almost need to wish my mother's life away. Otherwise, he said, she's got to live for 7 years. Otherwise, how his business is set up, because his mother, quite rightly, wanted to stay a partner in the firm. He said, I will be liable to inheritance tax. Now, you might think, well, poor boo-hoo you, Paul, you have to sell some land. But if he sells land, his already marginal business becomes even more marginal. So how will he go and pay for the inheritance tax bill, which the government want him to pay? And yes, they want to split it over 10 years, but we're talking still plus £1 million in inheritance tax. He's got 7 properties on his farm, old farm workers' cottages, when they used to employ more people on the land. Now modern machinery has replaced human resource, so therefore the cottages that used to house working staff now house retired farm workers who worked for the bakers over the years, and they pay a peppercorn rent. And it's a bit like an old-fashioned system that still exists quite often on larger farms and estates, where when you retire, you have a house for life until you and your spouse pass away, and then the house comes back in. He happens to have 7, and he said, so therefore his choices are, should his mother not die conveniently for him, but inconveniently with the following 7 years, he will have to sell some or all of those houses and basically make loyal, not just former staff, they're friends of his, redundant, to sell the houses to pay for the inheritance tax bill. Or he'll have to sell land, which will then make his business even less profitable. Well, that guy started crying. Now, I know Paul relatively well. He's not a man I ever once believed I'd see a tear in his eye. He's not some great big roughy-tofty farmer, but he's not a man. His son, who was 14, same age as Charlie, my son, I know his son then started crying. And there's all these big old burly farmers stood around, and they don't know where to put themselves, because a man who they've grown up with, half of them gone to school with him, he's a neighbour of theirs, is suddenly breaking down, telling this to an MP. And then 3 men along to his right, another farmer, was champion pig farmer 3 times. His stock was that good. He's a pig farmer. And he just said, very straightforward, he said, 8 months ago I tried to kill myself. And he said, I very nearly succeeded. And he pointed over to a chap who's 2 seats down from me. So if it weren't for him, I'd probably have had another go and succeeded the next time. And this guy is from a charity called Yana, who help people with mental ill health. And he said the reason why he tried to commit suicide was because he's a 3rd generation farmer. He said his grandfather first bought the land, 76 acres. His father built the business up and grew the amount of land. And in the golden period of farming, when we were getting loads of subsidies from the EU and everything was hunky-dory and it was quite easy to make money, his father built the business. And then this chap took it on and he's successful. I mean, he's 3 times award-winning. He's the best in the country at producing pigs. I don't know what the criteria for judging them that is, but that means he's the best in the pig industry in the UK. And he said, the books didn't add up. I couldn't make any money. He said the farm was going under financially. He said I couldn't look my father in the face because all I thought on my watch was that I was going to lose the business my grandfather had worked so hard to set up. And he said I couldn't look at my wife. He said, so I tried to take my own life. He said, by pure luck, I didn't succeed. And 8 months later, and this guy there, he's a big lad, right? You wouldn't want to get in a fight with him in a pub brawl. And I could see Adrian Ramsey, who perhaps wouldn't necessarily be the farmer's friend, but he's a member of the Green Party. People of the Green Party tend to be quite emotionally engaged. And I could see Adrian's face change. And I think he realized the enormity of what this meant. And then a couple of us who aren't actually directly farmers, we work for farmers, we said, well, these people here, they are fearing for their businesses. When their businesses go, which they inevitably will with this budget, that will affect us. There were contractors, hedge layers, a guy who cuts thatching straw. All these people there were saying that our business is going to go. Will Adrian Ramsey be able to make, as one of the handful of Green MPs, any difference by his lobbying on our behalf? Is he an effective lobbyist? Will he plight our troth? I don't know. That's what he was voted in. I didn't vote for him. I most certainly didn't vote Green. But we've got to put our faith in him. But we've got to put our faith in democracy. And I think with such a vast Labour majority, I think even if he was a narrator of the standard of Churchill, he ain't going to be able to do it.
So what has gone wrong with these farms that has led them to be failing financially and not making the money that they should do? I mean, if the 2 generations prior managed to get it during EU subsidies, how have they been failed in order to put them in a position where this is becoming incredibly financially draining on a lot of farms?
James Rebanks has recently wrote an article in Unheard, and James Rebanks is a very intelligent farmer from up north, and he summed it up very well. And what we've essentially got, and we've had for an extremely long time, is a broken food system. Land prices kept going up. Food prices kept going down. The costs of inputs that farmers have to spend on producing that food have gone up. We know that there was a point not that long ago where it cost dairy farmers more to produce a pint of milk than they receive from a supermarket. There are so many elements of where the food system is broken so that neither farmers can make money, nor is there any food security of where we get our food from. We're 54% food resilient in this country, that the whole root and branch thing has gone wrong. When we were in the EU, it didn't solve it. It just put a massive sticking plaster. It's no different. The EU and the Common Agricultural Policy was no different to the NHS. All that happens each time is you throw some money at it and you plug some of the holes in the dam, and then another bit squeaks out. But it's so complicated and so challenging, and in the light of the huge debt we have after COVID, and no one's released just how much money COVID cost us. COVID got in the way of a lot of negotiations that we were doing potentially with trade deals, and how we might start looking at our own, how we deal with British farmers and how we deal with British food, and how we may become more self-resilient and support farmers through the pounds in our pocket. There are so many elements of where the food issue has been failing us for years, that it's almost like, do you know what the Labour Party have tried to do? Is it's almost like that old horse that used to be lame on its off fore, now it's lame on its near hind. It's now actually, do you know what? It's now gone lame on its other foreleg. Let's take it out in the field and shoot it. That might be, if they're being hard-hearted, the thing they're trying to do is saying, do you know what? We're going to stop plastering over this. We want to put a bigger plaster on the NHS. So our sacrificial lamb to go and get that big sticking plaster to the NHS is the death of British farming. That could be if you were looking at it cynically.
It's an interesting choice, but then it begs the question of, like, in a world where geopolitically we're in such a horrible place with Russia and Ukraine and all these things and all these pots that are looking like they could boil over at any given moment, to relinquish our control of our food supply and become food security dependent on other countries seems like a terrible judgment call.
I think it is. And I think that one of the other reasons why the farmers probably feel quite aggrieved isn't just because of this smack that they've received from Rachel Reeves, is that they have, the Brexit dividend that they were told was coming to them has been nearly as difficult to see as the one that was promised to the British sea fishing fleet. That hasn't happened. British sea fishing's gone completely down the plug hole, and farming is going the same way. And I think they feel aggrieved. Why they've decided, they being the government, have decided to attack, and I think attack it is, the farmers, I think must be politically motivated. I think this government is much more politically driven in an old school socialism, and not even in the Corbyn brand of socialism. Corbyn at least was very honest. This is being dressed up with some pretty thin gruel, but I'm sure that the rural sector are seen as a hindrance to the advancement of some of the plans that they have, and that they're just a throwback to old Tories. I think the Prime Minister wasn't even in London when we went on this protest, but if they looked out of any of those Whitehall offices, and they saw that protest, and they saw those people in flat caps and waterproof green coats and wellies, they didn't see working people. What they would have seen was working people, but they were the wrong sort of working people. Now, I will admit, I am a conservative. I'm no longer a card-carrying conservative, but I'm a conservative by rote. I have almost an inbuilt mistrust of Labour politicians. But I think in this particular instance, if I put my party politics aside, I can see no financial sense for it. And if there's a political reason, then it can only be that they want to do an attack on a certain section of society.
I've spent a long time just researching and having a look at places that to find the counterpoint against farmers paying inheritance tax, etc. And of course, we've touched on that. There's land bankers, and there is figures out there, which is I question, because I see them getting torn down on Twitter, which is not a place where I get all my political information. But like, there's a people quoting large percentages of land which is occupied by people as investments, which we have discussed that is kind of where they're going with it. But it seems like an absolute own goal to be also in the same swoop that you are trying to tax people that are asset rich, um, to be also single-handedly destroying food chain, supply chain, and just people that are asset rich and cash poor. It does seem like a politically, purely talking politically, seems like a massive own goal, because farmers aren't incredibly unpopular. Um, it's like trying to do a pay cut for NHS nurses or for junior doctors. It seems like a political own goal to be doing this.
I think it is. And also, do you know, I learned a fascinating thing that I hadn't thought of before, was that one of the younger farmers who was in that meeting with Adrian Ramsey, he said, well, it's all very well and good to point the finger at people who have bought land and not farm it themselves, and point the finger at them saying you're filthy land bankers. But he's a young man, Louis. I know him from Young Farmers. I've done a number of farm walks for him. He's in the Debenham Young Farmers, and he said that, you know, his family farm is insufficiently big enough for him to take it over, and he's got an older brother, so therefore he's got 100 acres off his father, which is no way you could sustain that. They've already split their farm up, and he farms 100 acres under his own right. But he contract farms a number of other blocks of land that are owned by these supposed land bankers, rich individuals who want it. And he says, no, they want it farmed, just they don't know how to themselves. So they pay him on a profit share basis to farm it. And because they have got more liquidity, because they're actually privately wealthy from things other than farming, they're more likely to invest in regenerative agriculture, which is very pricey to buy those drills. And he said, I'm working a regenerative direct drill on the back of his tractor, where he drills the seed in the land, courtesy of these supposed fat cats who have come in and have bought land and they're not working it. So this rather simplistic answer that I had when I set out on that protest, well, I can see, okay, if we buy this narrative, it's those rich people who bought this land and they're not working it. There are certainly some corporates, and that was the feedback I got from a lot of farmers. If they wanted to point the finger at who could we tax more, it's the big corporates. It's the airlines, the oil companies, the big tech companies who have bought up land and they want to fill it with carbon neutral land usage, or offset it for biodiversity net gain with a load of trees that won't get looked after very well. You tax them. But should we be taxing the land that grows our food on a political whim? It seems, as you've already eloquently highlighted, completely counterintuitive. So what did that protest bring? What did it work? What do you think?
It highlighted a lot of emotional stories of real life people that really we're actively going after, people that probably shouldn't pay or can't afford to pay inheritance tax at the cost of not just their finances, but food security and stuff that's much bigger than them. So it seems like an own goal. But then also, when you say about the big corporations, they're also the people that are sitting in you and I's pension pot. You know, I've got shares in a variety of big corporations that probably do buy farmland, offset things. Like BP, they have a huge BP. I don't think oil is going to be the big thing in the next 50 years, but I have an allocation to BP in my ISA, and I hope that as oil phases out, the green energy thing gets off. So do I want, purely in self-interest, do I want them to have to pay a enormous tax bill and get punished? Well, no, because my pension pot goes down.
But, it's not selfish, Callum, solely, is it? It's because it's the pensions of everybody. And if the pensions go fut, then, well, my God, not only will we starve, but the banks will collapse. And we don't have any gold to sell off. There's no way we could afford after COVID to bail out the banks to the same degree that Gordon Brown was forced to do with HBOS. So we couldn't do that again. Let's just say Rachel Reeves's figure, this so-called £22 billion black hole, I've never actually seen the figures for it. Jeremy Hunt, the previous Chancellor under the last administration, is not a man known for his exuberance. He is the archetypal grey man in a grey suit, in a grey job. But he more or less said in parliamentary terms, you're talking out of your fucking arse to Reeves, right? And if he's going to go and stick his head above the parapet and say, show me your workings out, and she won't do it, I assume that the £22 billion black hole is probably a bit mythical. And what they're actually saying is it's a lot larger black hole than that, caused by how much money we spent out on furlough and all the other things that went around with COVID. So we need to fill that. Is it right to fill it at the expense of taxing soil and the people who work it? I don't think so. And so therefore that's why I was protesting there, because I think you just say, wake up, it's bloody stupid, and you are hurting people, and ultimately hurting me, and actually, as you've just very eloquently highlighted, they're hurting you too.
The key takeaways I get is that the budget has caused there's a huge, they've come after land bankers and not quite succeeded. Well, actually, they have succeeded, but they've also scored a massive own goal by coming after farmers that can't afford it and can't pay for it. They've grossly miscalculated the payments that farms get. The figures are all off. They probably need to have a full review of how much farmers are actually making and what the impact of this is, because this seems like they fell into power almost by accident and have rushed the budget through it. That seems to be what it is. And then they probably need to review the BPS and the funding of everything else, because that is also, as we discussed in the last week's episode, destroying the rural economy and taking liquidity from places that need it. I overheard some farmers on the train talking about how it's only the funding and the BPS payments and things like that that actually make the farm profitable. Otherwise, it's not really worth doing. Do we want lots of farmers giving up? Labour has put people in a position that have made farmers giving up. So the question is, what are the practical steps that anybody can do if you're sitting here saying, okay, I've learned about it, I understand it, now what can I do to do this?
Okay. I think for Joe Public, what the farmers decide to do next will doubtless be probably not quite so overt. It may be some more direct action. I don't know. I think the NFU will continue to lobby. But what can we do as Joe Public? Well, I've written a letter to my MP. I've now met him in person. I think, how our parliamentary democracy works is that writing letters to your constituency MP and stating your concerns over this, I think this podcast, and I'm sure there's many other ones who have laid it out, probably less wordly than I do, is my verbosity is my Achilles heel, that you need to lay out as to why you support us, exactly as I spoke to those two guys in their ambulance. Write to your MP, tell them that you think that this is an unfair situation, and ask for them to go for a review. But if you don't have a Labour MP and you have a Conservative, a Reform or a Green MP, you may even have a Lib Dem, write to them and don't just ask them to lobby government to change their mind. What I think is a very sensible thing is to ask them. We all know, and I think we all believe, that Rachel Reeves and the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for DEFRA have made a monumental miscalculation in haste on this budget decision. If they are going to climb down wholly or partly, that means they're going to have to make a U-turn. And in political terms, that is something that in modern politics, ever since Margaret Thatcher made that great speech and everyone thought it was the best thing since Boudicca told the Ninth Legion to fuck off, right? That making a U-turn is now seen in politics, or changing your mind when given better facts and figures, is now seen as the thing you cannot do. That is a line we will not cross.
It's an admission of failure.
Admission of failure,
just won't
correct.
happen.
And I would urge your MP not to gloat, not to point. Don't make this a political decision. Labour have been vitriolic in their political decision to attack a certain section of our society. Don't make this a political win. What you've got to do is you can say, we're going to support you to make a decision. If you make the right choice and don't destroy family farms, don't destroy the rural economy, control and help our food security and our entire food system, will support you. We will stand up in the House and support you, not make a political point. You will probably be wasting the skin off your fingers when you're typing that email to them. But if we all urged our MPs to lobby for us, but not gloat, not rub it in that these dudes have made a mistake when they make a U-turn, and by God, we hope they do, that, I think, is the letter you have to write to your MP if they happen to not be a Labour one. If you write a letter to your MP and he or she is a Labour MP, you have to do so with brevity, with some facts, things that matter to you as an individual and to your local economy and society, but also with a little bit of passion and no vitriol. Have the same mindset as those farmers and you and me who are out there on Whitehall yesterday. You need to have a tinge of sadness and regret and almost bewilderment that this thing has ever come to pass.
How can I find my local MP's email address and or contact details?
There is actually the website, which is Find My MP, and it's got there, you type in your postcode and it tells you who your MP is and it gives you their contact details, usually in their parliamentary office. This should be a mass movement. A well-worded, polite email is something which they have to respond to. Will they listen to it? Will they act upon it? That's up to them. And they will pass on to people and say, gosh, there's a weight of opinion. This is not politically sensible. And let's be perfectly honest, political parties are businesses. If they realize that they're selling, if they were Walker's Crisps and they decided to go and launch a new flavor called Spaniel's Arse, right? And they pushed it, had a great marketing campaign. They got Gary Lineker dressed up as a Spaniel's arse. He's got time on his hands now. There he is, looking like this puckered little thing with fluffy bits around there like that. And they market it and they've done everything they can. And the feedback is 97% of the British populace say, Walker's Spaniel's Arse crisps taste like Spaniel's arse. They will pull it. And that's the only way we can do it. You've got to treat your MP like you saying you don't like to eat Spaniel's arse crisps. You've just got to go and lobby them, and eventually they'll pass it on.
I think we have summarised the feeling of the British countryside as a whole. We have given a good insight into what's happening. I try to think we've given a subjective overview, but generally, the consensus is this is a huge misstep by the Labour government and we need to change things. I think we've given people practical steps that they can use to help the cause, should they feel inclined to. And also, If they have got differing opinions, I'm happy to hear them on Twitter or one of the other social media platforms. Drop us a message. I hope you've enjoyed CountrySlide. We will be back next week on Friday for a new episode, which will be far less political and probably far more banter. We'll be joined next week by Richard Prideaux, and he will be telling us all about the adventures that he got up to and also adventures that we're getting up to in the next week. Richard, is there anything you'd like to say?
No, I'm just going to remind everyone, please email your MP and just remind a bit of humility. Please encourage them for those in opposition and be polite but forceful and factual to those if you're writing and you've got a Labour MP. I'm going to go off and lay a hedge now on the Barker's farm, and because it's cold, and so I'll work quite fast. And then tonight I've got to write an article for the Critic about the farmers' protest, so I'll just have to try and put down in with much more brevity than I've used in this podcast format. What are you up to for the rest of the day, Callum?
Today will be, I am off to London again, so that's 3 days in London on the bout. I will be photographing at Davies Wine Bar, a very, very nice, independently owned wine bar. They've got lots of franchises and they support the port industry with lots of nice drinks. And they're going to be making port cocktails and lots of jolly things and port and cheese boards, and it is absolutely incredible. So I will be photographing that tonight, and I will be eating lots of cheese, and I'll be drinking quite a lot of port, and I will have all the fun stuff.
I have a suggestion. I think we ought to put, because you go to lots of posh places to take photographs, right? I think we ought to occasionally put this podcast on the road, right? And I think doing it, eating cheese and drinking port in London, can you imagine the coherence that you would get from us?
We should definitely do a drunken Christmas podcast where we finish off a large red wine and get slightly obscene.
Exactly. Keep pass. We could actually literally pass the port to the left. If they've got three of us in a row, we could just pass it, and each time we just got to go and sort of, as if we're metaphorically speaking, past a port to the left. Now listen, good news, Callum. I've just had an email from the editor at the East Anglian Daily Times. They want some of your photographs of us at the protest yesterday. So you haven't lost them all, have you?
Oh, yeah, this is a great little story. Yesterday...
Yeah, this is for the camera geeks amongst you.
The man that had the giant megaphone, I was trying to get the money shot of him shouting. And as I did, the card filled up. So I was very tired because my baby had me up practically all night. And I formatted a card which I thought was the right card, which wasn't the right card. So I deleted every single picture off of the memory card, which was fantastic. So I put that in my coat pocket. I shot on the other card, and then thankfully I managed to fumble about and recover all of the data from the card last night. So we are in business. We have all the images. They're all safe and sound. But if you ever need it, you will have to buy recovery software, which costs quite a few quid. But we're back in business. We got it sorted.
Anyway, we're done. Have a good rest of your day. And thank you very much for listening, everybody. Do contact us. I have no idea how you do that. You can contact me via @TrooperSnooks. And Callum, how can people contact you?
X.com is Callum McInerney, CallumMcInerney. I was thinking if I became Prime Minister with the name McInerney Riley, they wouldn't be able to do any good placards for me, because by the time they'd written my second name, they would have run out, and it doesn't rhyme with anything. A little bit liey, McInerney Riley.
I mean, Starmer the farmer harmer, Reeves thieves. I mean, everything was just literally against them. Whereas McInerney Riley, well, I mean, yeah, it's impossible. You could. There is nothing. You could wax lyrical on any subject. You could tax anybody, anything you like. You could tax priests.
They'd have to just turn me into a rat.
Yeah, they would.
On a placard.
Yeah, you'd all be an AI. They'd probably shorten your name. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway.
McRiley. I used to get McRiley at school.
McRiley. Yeah, I probably do. Right. Anyway, old boy, it's lovely to talk to you, and thank you for listening, everyone.